So this is chapter 12 on nervous tissue, and in general the nervous system, where we find nervous tissue, it's very complex, and the nervous system is the foundation of our conscious experience, personality, and behavior. So thinking about the basic ways that a neuron behaves, but how a collection of them combined together make you who you are, and can make individuals feel emotions and give them personality. All of that is pretty amazing stuff, but it all starts with knowing the basic physiology of the nervous tissue. And so there is an area of science called neurobiology, which combines the behavior and the life sciences. So looking at section 12.1, a learning outcome should be to describe the overall function of the nervous system and then describe its major anatomical and functional divisions. We are multicellular organisms, and there needs to be coordination between all the cells of our body, and there's two ways that occurs, or two systems responsible for that. One is the endocrine system and the other is the nervous system. And the endocrine system involves hormones and glands that release hormones. It's slower, and the nervous system involves neurons and other support cells, and this kind of communication is much faster. Those are the two main ways of communicating. Again, the nervous system, or the endocrine system, involves communicating by hormones, and any changes that occur due to these hormones throughout the body is going to be slower. The nervous system is going to employ electrical and chemical means to send messages from cell to cell, and it's much more rapid. The nervous system carries its tasks out in three basic steps. One is to receive information, and once that information is received, we're going to move it to the brain or the spinal cord, which is the central nervous system. From there, we have to process the information and relate it to past experiences to determine what kind of response to produce. And then the central nervous system will send out commands to muscles and glands that will carry out those responses. There's two major subdivisions of the nervous system. One is the central nervous system, or the CNS. This involves the brain and the spinal cord, which are enclosed by the cranium and the vertebral column. The cranium protects the brain, the vertebral column protects the spinal cord. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, and these are all of the nervous system except the brain and spinal cord, and this includes nerves and ganglia. And so what is a nerve? A nerve is going to be a bundle of nerve fibers, which are axons, which are wrapped in connective tissue. And a ganglion is a knot-like swelling in a nerve where neuron cell bodies are concentrated. You might recall us drawing in class a basic neuron, and in our lab regarding tissues, the chapter on tissues, basic neuron is going to have a cell body right here with a nucleus. It's going to have little extensions that bring information in. They're called dendrites. The body right here is the neurosoma, and this long extension in which the information leaves the nerve cell out to wherever it's sending the message to is going to be called the axon. And so the basic structure of a neuron. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system is going to contain, and so this is something to look at here. It's going to contain both visceral and motor divisions. Okay, so we have both, I'm sorry, back up. I think I said visceral. It's going to contain both sensory and motor divisions. sensory is going to bring information in, motor division is going to send information out. And for each of those divisions, both the sensory and the motor neuron are going to contain a somatic and visceral subdivision. So the sensory has a somatic and visceral subdivision, and the motor division has both somatic and visceral. The sensory is also called afferent, which carries signals to the CNS. And then again, we have two subdivisions: the somatic sensory division, which carries signals from the skin, the muscle, bones, and joints. And then we have the visceral. Visceral refers to your internal organs. So we have the visceral sensory division, which carries signals from your viscera, which includes heart, lungs, stomach, urinary bladder, and other small intestine, and so on. Then we have the efferent, or motor division, and this is going to carry signals away from the central nervous system to structures we call effectors. These are the things that the motor neuron acts on, like glands and muscles, which will carry out the responses. And then we have this broken up into two parts. We have the somatic motor division, which carries signals to skeletal muscles, and the output produces contraction in the muscle, as well as some somatic reflexes or involuntary muscle contractions. For example, when you go to the doctor and they hit you on the knee and your leg kicks out, the knee-jerk reflex, that's an example of a somatic reflex. And then there's the visceral motor division. It's also called autonomic, and if we pause for a little bit and think about it, when is the last time any of us have had to think about moving food through our digestive system? It does it on its own. It's automatic. It's autonomic. Okay, so visceral. Here, we're going to carry out signals to glands, cardiac, and smooth muscle. And smooth muscle, for example, lines the stomach and the intestines. And so this would involve involuntary responses, which we would refer to as visceral reflexes. That last one we're talking about, the visceral motor division, or of the autonomic nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system has both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So we separated the two. The sympathetic division is going to tend to bring about action within the body, arouse the body to action. So this might occur, things that occur would be accelerating your heartbeat, your respiration, and inhibiting things that you may not need at the particular moment. For example, if you got really scared, say a dog started chasing you, and you're afraid the dog's going to bite you, you're going to want to increase your heart rate, increase respiration, get oxygen to your muscles. You're going to want to divert blood from your digestion and urinary system. So you don't need those. You don't need to be digesting at this moment. Right now it's about getting away from the dog. Parasympathetic division is different. It's going to have an opposite effect here. It's going to have a calming effect, slow the heart rate, slow breathing. And then we're going to stimulate digestion and urinary systems. So here we'd send more blood to these systems so they can become more active. And so that would be parasympathetic division. This diagram just kind of highlights the two major divisions: the central nervous system, which is highlighted in this blue color, and then the pinkish color includes the peripheral nervous system, all of the nerves that leave the brain and the spinal cord. And speaking of which, leaving the spinal cord, there's these bulging structures here that come out of the branches that leave the spinal cord. Those are ganglia. Those were the collection of nerve cell bodies, and then the axons leave, or the nerve fibers leave out through the nerve itself. Here's a nice diagram that summarizes everything we just covered. We have the nervous system, central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Then for the peripheral nervous system, we have both the sensory and motor divisions, and each one is going to have visceral and somatic divisions. And then the visceral motor division, or the autonomic division, has sympathetic and parasympathetic. Remember, sympathetic is one of arousal, the other one is one of calming. And so that is it for section 1. For section 2, we're going to look at the properties of neurons. As a learner, we should be able to describe 3 functional properties found in all neurons. Define the 3 most basic functional categories of neurons, and identify the parts of the neuron, and then explain how neurons transport materials between the cell body and the axon. So, what are some universal properties of neurons? They are excitable, which means they can respond to environmental changes, which we would call stimuli, which is plural for stimulus. They have conductivity, like a muscle cell, and secretion. When an electrical signal reaches the end of the nerve fiber, the cell is going to secrete neurotransmitters, which we covered in the interaction between nerve and muscle at the neuromuscular junction. This particular neurotransmitter was acetylcholine. So now we're going to look at functional classes of neurons. There's the sensory or afferent neuron. These are going to be the ones that bring information into the central nervous system. They detect stimuli and transmit information about them towards the CNS. Then we have interneurons, or these are association neurons, and they're going to lie entirely within the CNS, and they're going to connect the motor to the sensory. So we're talking about sensory, interneuron in the middle, then the central nervous system, and then connect to the motor neurons. So these interneurons receive signals from many neurons and carry out integrative function. So basically processing, making decisions about what kind of responses are going to result. And then we have the motor neuron, or efferent, like leaving. So here, these are going to send signals out to muscles and glands, which are, as we defined earlier, the effectors. This diagram just shows the different classes. We have sensory neurons. For example, we might have touch receptors in the fingertips there. They're going to send information. So here's your neuron, sensory neuron. Then right here is your interneuron, found within the central nervous system, which would be the brain or the spinal cord. And then that's going to send information out to the motor neuron, to some effector like this muscle that we see right here. So looking at the specific structure of a neuron, the soma is the main control center of the neuron, and or neurosoma is another term we can use, which translates means nerve cell body. It has a single central located nucleus with a large nucleolus. There's the nucleus and the nucleolus. Recall the nucleolus. The nucleus contains the DNA, and the nucleolus produces ribosomal RNA. There's a cytoplasm in there, and that cytoplasm contains organelles, proteins, and cytoskeleton. Organelles include mitochondria, which produce ATP, energy for the cell, lysosomes. Recall those are the for digesting worn out parts. Golgi complex, which is membrane organelles that modify and package materials. Inclusions and extensive rough ER and cytoplasm. Remember, the rough ER is where proteins are produced. Inclusions are glycogen, lipid droplets, melanin, and lipofuscin pigment, which is produced when lysosomes digest old organelles. And the cytoskeleton has dense mesh of microtubules and neurofibrils, or bundles of actin filaments, which compartmentalize rough ER into dark staining Nissl bodies. There are no centrioles and no mitosis, which means the nucleus in the cell body itself does not divide. Dendrites are branches that come off the soma, the primary site of receiving signals and other neurons. The more dendrites the neuron has, the more information it can receive. And these dendrites, which are these structures right here, They're going to provide precise pathways for the reception and processing of information. The axon, also called the nerve fiber, originates from a mound on the soma called the axon hillock. Here's the axon hillock right here. The axon is cylindrical, relatively unbranched for most of its length. When it does branch, they're called axon collaterals. There's an example here. We see most of it is unbranched all the way down. At the very end, or the distal end of it, you're going to have extensive branching. This part is specialized for rapid conduction of signals to distant points. The cytoplasm that occurs within, specifically within the axon, is called the axoplasm, and the membrane on the axon is called the axolemma, and only one axon per neuron. So each neuron will have only one axon. There's also a myelin sheath that encloses the axon. It's a sort of insulation there. You can see the myelin sheath, and actually some gaps between those sheaths. There's special cells that will be covered later that produce this myelin structure. The distal end of the axon has terminal arborization, or extensive branching, so that's identified right there. The synaptic knob, or the terminal button, is the swelling at the end, which we saw in the last chapter at the neuromuscular junction. And there at the synaptic knob is where you have your synaptic vesicles, which release neurotransmitters, for example, the acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. The structure, continuing the structure of the neuron, we have different kinds of neurons. There's multipolar neuron, which again, only one axis, but has multiple dendrites. This is most common, and most of the neurons in the CNS are multipolar. And we have bipolar neurons, where you have only one axon and one dendrite, and those are highlighted right here, or illustrated here. And you find these in olfactory cells, which are used for smell, in the retina, which is in the eye and in the inner ear. Then we have unipolar neurons. This is a single process leading away from the soma. And here it includes sensory cells from the skin and organs of the spinal cord. So here's a unipolar neuron. And then we have an axonic neuron, which has many dendrites but no axon. It's illustrated right here. You can find these in the retina, brain, and adrenal gland. And now the little subtopic of axonal transport, or transport through the axon. Many proteins are going to be made in the soma. That makes sense because that's where the nucleus is, that's where the DNA is. So DNA will be used to produce mRNA, a process called transcription, which we covered early on. And then once the mRNA is produced, it goes to the ribosome on rough ER or free ribosomes, so that we can translate and produce polypeptide chains, which will be turned into proteins. So many of these proteins produced in the soma have to be transported to the axon, and then towards the end of the axon. And this could be to repair the axolemma, or proteins that serve as gated channels along the axon, along the axolemma, or the membrane of the axon, and enzymes and neurotransmitters would be transported through the enzyme. The axonal transport is a two-way passage of proteins, organelles, and other materials along the axon. There's going to be two kinds. There's anterograde transport, which means to move down the axon away from the soma. And then there's retro, which means back, right, toward the back, which means to move back up the axon towards the soma. There's a network of protein fibers, or microtubules, that are going to guide the materials along the axon. And there's going to be special proteins motor proteins called kinesin and dynein, that carry molecules on their back. So they kind of crawl along these microtubules, of course using energy to do so. The kinesin is a motor protein that is anterograde, so it's going to help move stuff down towards the end of the axon away from the soma. And dynein is a motor protein for retrograde transport, bringing stuff back. Okay, so there's fast axonal transport, and this will be at a rate of 20 millimeters to 400 millimeters per day. 20 millimeters is a little less than an inch, or less than an inch per day. So that's fast axonal transport going through there. And there's fast anterograde transport, and here this is to move organelles, enzymes, synaptic vesicles like the ones that had acetylcholine in the last chapter at neuromuscular junction, and small molecules. Then we have fast retrograde transport. This is for recycled materials and pathogens. Unfortunately, also follow this path. For example, diseases of the nervous system include rabies, herpes simplex, tetanus, and poliovirus. Their delay from being infected to getting the symptoms is related to the time needed to transport the pathogen back towards the neurosoma. So it does take some time, but it does follow the route through the axon. And then there's slow axonal transport, and that's going to be 0.5 to 10 millimeters per day, and this is always going to be anterograde. For most enzymes, cytoskeleton components, and new axoplasm, moving down the axon during repair and regeneration of damaged axons. So during the repair of damaged axons, this slow axonal transport would be observed. Damaged nerve fibers are going to basically, the regeneration time would be related to the speed of slow axonal transport, or getting those materials and components down there.